Up the 140th anniversary of the launch of Amateur Photographer magazine, we are looking back at all the landmark cameras that have been launched since AP's history in 1884. And this is the second of the videos we're looking at. In this video, we're focusing on cameras launched between the two world wars, so the 1920s and 1930s, which is a very prolific period for camera innovation, isn't it, John? So we're going to just have a look at what we've got here today.
Okay, fine. So World War I ended 1918. I think it took a while for the camera industry, particularly in Germany, to get on its feet. The first major landmark, I guess, was the Leica. Now, this was the brainchild of a man called Oscar Barnack, who joined Leica around about 1912, before the war, as a director of research. And he was originally put in charge of producing a new cine camera of some sort, which of course took 35mm film in those days. And gradually he came to realise that 35mm was probably a good format for a still camera as well. Had a lot of resistance to it. We won't go into all the details, but he produced a prototype which he showed to Ernst Leitz, who wasn't terribly impressed, but went ahead and produced about 13 first editions, put it out to people to have a look at, put it out to professional photographers. They didn't think much of it either. But Ernst Leitz was a man who was quite a trailblazer. He said, no, we're going to build it anyway. And they built the first Leica. This is the Leica I. This actual camera, according to its serial number, was produced in 1926. So it must be very early on. The camera first appeared in 1925 at the Leipzig Spring Fair. And it had a retractable lens like that, a wind here, shutter speeds which were set there, apertures which were set around the lens, pretty bog standard, pretty much so. It wasn't an interchangeable lens camera at this stage. A few years later, they did produce an interchangeable lens version of the first one, but the lenses could only be used on the bodies which they were made for.
Okay.
So you had to have the lens and body, you couldn't interchange. And then later on, they produced them so that they would fit universal, any lens would fit any camera, with what then became the very common 39mm screw lens, which Leica adopted. A very simple camera, obviously. No rangefinder, just a straightforward viewfinder on the top. Press that in, turn this to focus, guess the focusing, guess the shutter speed, guess the aperture, etc., etc. But floss focal plane shutter inside, and it took 35mm film, which we discussed in a previous video, but it's worth mentioning again. The 35mm up until this point was a cine film, and nobody really thought of it as being anything that you could use in a still camera. And 35mm ran through projectors and cine cameras in a vertical format and produced an 18 by 24mm format. What Mr. Barnack did is he produced this for 35mm. He ran it horizontally through the body rather than vertically, enlarged one of the frame sizes, doubled it, so we went from 18 by 24 to 24 by 36.
Just doubled it, basically.
Which became the standard full frame format and exists even today in the digital world. So that was the first, not the first 35mm camera. There were cameras which took 35mm, but not in a viable way. This was the first one to really become viable.
Do we know why the Leica, why this took off, other ones didn't, and why this is...
Well, it didn't. It didn't immediately, but of course it was the only one.
Right.
And gradually, professional photographers realised you could get a decent picture out of that tiny frame, which was the biggest thing.
Which effectively made photography much more portable, like high quality.
Well, yeah.
I mean, in this series of videos, we're looking at probably about 20 cameras, aren't we? The whole series of landmark cameras. But if you had to narrow it down to like 3, this would be one of them, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
The most influential camera of all time.
Yeah.
Amazing. And the basic shape, obviously, it's changed quite a lot over the years, but the basic box is the same.
Yes. Well, yes. The Leica, there's the Leica I, and I'm not going to recite all the different models, even if I can remember them. We went right up to the 3F, and they were still basically the same sort of shape. I mean, the Leica II was the first one that actually had a rangefinder, etc., etc. the 3G, which was the last of the screw lens cameras like this, was actually produced after the M3, which was the first bayonet camera,
right,
which we'll be talking about in another video a little later. But yes, a very basic camera, a very basic design, but the classic design. So that's 1925, the first Leica. 1928, we come to another landmark, a well-known name, and the first of it. So this is the first Rolleiflex. Now, it was produced by a German company called Frank and Heidecker, who came together originally to build stereo cameras. I think I've got it the right way around, that Heidecker was the designer, he was the cameraman, and Frank was the accountant, he was the money man, and they came together. And Heidecker had actually always wanted to build a twin-lens reflex, but he'd worked for Voigtlander before and they wouldn't let him do it.
Okay.
And he'd produced a stereo camera for Voigtlander. So when they started Frank and Heidecker, they stuck with what they knew for a bit, and they produced a stereo camera, which they called the Hydroscope. And it was a plate camera for stereo pictures. And it had 3 lenses, 2 to take the picture, as you need for any stereo camera, and 1 in the middle, which reflected its image to the viewfinder. They then went on to build a roll film version of that, which they called the Rolleiflex, or the Rolleiflex, as it became known. And eventually, they produced their first twin-lens reflex, which is what they wanted. All they did was turn the stereo camera inside, remove one of the lenses, took the viewfinder off the side and put it in the top, and produced the first twin-lens reflex.
Right, okay, so that's how the twin-lens reflex, because it came from stereo photography.
Yes, absolutely. Now, when I say it was the first, obviously it wasn't. There were twin-lens reflexes that went way back to plate cameras, etc., the earliest days. But what made this special, it was the first roll film twin-lens reflex, the first really compact. I mean, twin-lens reflexes could be this size until then. Yeah. The first really compact twin-lens reflex. And that's the first Rolleiflex. And of course, they called it the roll, because they'd had the roll Hydroscope, the Rolleiflex, they called it the Rolleiflex, the Rolleiflex.
I see, so the roll comes from roll film.
Yes, yeah.
All right.
So there's the first one.
And for those who aren't familiar with the twins reflex, the idea is that the bottom lens is the one that takes the picture on the film, and the top lens is purely for viewing. It is bounced up onto the screen.
So on the screen you have a ground glass screen, the same size as the image size, and you would use it like that.
But obviously the distance to the screen is the same as that to the film, so that when you're focusing on the screen, you're also focusing on...
Absolutely. You've got parallax problems, of course, because they are 2 different things, but not noticeable until they got in quite close. And a very popular camera itself. So that's the first Rolleiflex. But
I have a Rolleiflex, but it's a much later version. It's the 50s or 60s one.
But as with the Leica, I mean, I've got an Ultimate. It's the same basic design. It's still a box with 2 lenses on the front.
This again was the camera used by so many professional photographers, especially in the sort of the fashion world. People like Bailey used a Rolleiflex, didn't he? And
absolutely.
Before him, like there's that whole era of Cecil Beaton and those sort of people would have used these sort of cameras. Yeah, amazing.
And they would have thought of them as miniature format cameras, because until then they've been talking about quarter plate, 5x4, cut film, etc. So cameras like this were thought of as almost as miniature cameras. So when the Leica came along, that became the miniature camera, and the roll film cameras became the medium format. Yeah. Now, you asked a moment ago why it took so long for this great gain in popularity. It took a long time, the Leica, I mean, of course. It took a long time because people gradually had to come to terms with it. And so Zeiss Icon, who'd been toddling along in the background at this point, watched what was happening. And it wasn't until 1932 that they produced their version of it, which was the Contax. This is a Contax I. When I say it's a Contax I, there are half a dozen, perhaps 5 or 6 different models of it. But this was their answer to the Leica. And many people said, it was just a rival to it. It was more than a rival. It was a totally different camera in many ways. The Leica used a cloth focal plane shutter going horizontally. This used a metal focal plane shutter that went vertically. It had a built-in rangefinder right from the start, which the Leica didn't. It's more of a heavyweight camera. The first models, for some strange reason, put the film wind on the front, which must have led to complications with gearing, etc. And so later on, the second model put it back on the top. But that's the Contax I.
It was more sophisticated than the Leica at the time.
Yeah, it was probably the better camera at the time. And of course,
more expensive.
They were about the same. There were different models. I mean, the basic camera was the same, but they varied in price with the lenses. And so you could pay about £50 for either of those.
Right.
But what was happening, you see, what shouldn't be overlooked is that in 1925, when Leica did that, Zeiss Icon didn't exist. It came together in 1926. After the First World War, Germany basically was on its uppers, and Zeiss were lens makers, not camera makers. And the engineered the coming together of 4 camera companies to form Zeiss Icon, to make cameras so that they could put their lenses on them, basically.
Right, okay.
And so many of them at the start were their versions of cameras which had previously been produced by any one of those four. The Contax was the first time they really buckled down and thought, we are going to produce our own camera. And that was the Contax I.
Mm.
And it went from there. The Contax II is a bit more streamlined. It's silver rather than black. It puts the wind on the top. The Contax III had a built-in meter. So it was a bit of a trailblazer.
Mm. Now, so I guess the sort of market would have been divided into Leica users and Contax.
Yes, I mean,
type of camera.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, it's like today when people, are you a Pentax man, or are you a Nikon man, or are you a Canon man? I'm sure it was much the same in those days. So you mentioned the price of those are probably around about £50 a time, when the average weekly wage by then, I don't know, maybe it was £2 a week, something like that. So expensive. But Kodak, as ever, stepped in and brought 35mm of the masses. And they did that with the Retina. So this was Kodak's Retina, which used 35mm film. It was foldable. If I can remember how to fold it. Yep, there we go. It folds. It was like that. And this was 10 guineas, or should I say £10, 10 shillings. Or £10.50 for those who are
so it was about a fifth of the price of the Contax and Leica.
Yeah, so it was a good half the price of those. And that really, I suppose, probably kick-started 35mm very much.
So they popularised it because this was still a very elitist.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so typical of Kodak. I mean, what Kodak liked to do was make photography simple for the man in the street. It wasn't as simple as some of their earlier cameras because there was still shutter speeds, apertures, focusing to worry about. But it brought 35mm to the masses.
And this was a very popular camera, wasn't it? The Retina.
And again, lots of different models of it.
You go back through back issues of Amateur Photographer, there were ads for this every week.
Oh, yes.
Big ads for this every week during the 30s, during that period.
Yeah. And the Retinas, and then there was the Retinettes and
yeah.
They made them bother.
There were also ads for Leicas, of course. But right.
So I suppose a lot of photographers would have started their 35mm journey with one of those and then aspired maybe to a Leica a little on. So that is 1934. If we jump forward a couple of years, 1937, we could look at something completely different. And that's this. This is the first Minox. This is the little camera which James Bond always kept in his top pocket and photographed the top secret
Connery
plans.
Bond.
Yeah, only by the light of a convenient desk lamp. It took film in twin little cartridges which dropped in the bottom, fed from one cartridge to the other. It was 9.5mm wide. You pull it out like that to not only wind the film but to tension the shutter. Release the shutter there. Very, very quiet. And this was made originally, this is the very first model. It was made in Latvia. And it was made by a man called Walter Zapp, who had really always wanted to produce a miniature camera. And he came up with several plans for them. And he wrote to Lights and he wrote to Oscar Barnett. Nobody took him on. So he produced it himself. in that bit. So, and that's the first model produced in 1937. After the war, the Germans came in, took over, and shifted everything to Wetzlar in West Germany. So all the later Minoxes, apart from this one, were made in Wetzlar. But this one is the original, made of stainless steel.
From Latvia. It's incredibly well made, isn't it?
Quite heavy, yeah, beautifully.
Nice piece of engineering.
But again, it's a camera which led to a lot of different models, a lot of different ideas. If she could produce their own version of it, the camera called the H-Ron.
And what was the film again?
It's 9.5mm wide. The film is in small cartridges, a bit like a 110 cartridge. So a little retainer on each end, and travels from one to the other as you open and close the shutter. So that advances the film, tensions the shutter, and you're off. So
1937. That's
that's because that was made in Latvia and it's the first model. It's known as the Riga Latvia, and you can see somewhere here actually the words made in Latvia on there, so you know it's the very first one. And so they obviously fetch a lot more money than the.
It was ahead of its time. If you look at it, compare it. I don't know how much that cost at the time, but
not sure.
If you compare it with the sort of Retina, this feels like something that's
very different. Very different.
A generation of technology ahead.
You'd almost expect that to be in the 50s or even the early 60s.
You would.
And of course they went on until that time. The Minox B introduced a light meter for the first time, and
the way it's just so rounded and sort
tactile,
of
isn't it?
Tiny and very precision, the precision controls and everything. It's great. You can see why James Bond liked.
Yes, I think its reputation was a little more than its actual capabilities.
Yeah.
I don't think you could actually photograph much by the larger a desk lamp, especially with the speed of films in those days. But nevertheless, it was very popular. So there we are. That's the Minox.
So what was the name of the guy again who made it?
Walter Zapp.
Was he German or was he Latvian?
No, he was Latvian.
He was Latvian.
He was Latvian, or German, Latvian, or something, a bit of both. But I think basically he was Latvian. Now, going right back in size, up in size, I must show this. Now there are those that say this is one of the ugliest cameras ever made, and those that say it's the most beautiful camera ever made. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I'm showing you this because it's the first camera with a built-in meter, and it's got several other. It is, as you can see, a twin lens reflex. The meter is indicated. The meter is under here, which I can
under the Contaflex.
There's the meter cell. Feeds a needle here, which unfortunately on this one has had its day, so it doesn't work. But that would have indicated an exposure, which you then set manually on here on apertures and shutter speeds. But the other interesting thing about it is the viewfinder and the taking lenses are two different focal lengths. Now, on the Rolleiflex, which we spoke about earlier, as you said, the viewfinder screen is the same size, which is absolutely fine. This is a 35mm camera. It took 35mm, which it ran through the camera that way.
Okay.
And a 35mm screen is going to be much too small for use. So what they did was they used a 5cm lens to take things, which is pretty much a standard lens for 35mm.
Yeah.
And they put an 8cm lens on the viewfinder lens, so you could get a bigger screen on the top.
Right.
But of course, the clever thing is that they are geared so that they both focus.
Right. Okay. And so the framing is the same.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is to me one of the classics. That's the old thing about what camera do you grab if the house is on fire. That's one of mine.
Is it really? Okay. How rare is this camera?
Yeah, it is quite rare. Mainly because it's very expensive. Well, no, it's not rare because it's expensive. It's expensive because it's rare.
Right. Was it at the time expensive? I imagine it was.
Yes. I could find adverts which will tell you exactly what it was. Well, I can't tell you off the top of my head.
The back issues of amateur photography in the archive at the time.
Absolutely. But again, it's nice. It's nice icon being being clever.
And when did this come out?
1935, this is. I don't know. It's heavy.
It is heavy, isn't it? Right. Contaflex. Nice.
By this time, Zeiss on Icon had begun to consolidate and get rid of a lot of the cameras that they had left over from the previous 4 companies, because so many of them were the same. So by this time, they started being innovative in their own way.
So obviously the gearing is behind the front of the camera because you can't see.
No.
Nice.
And I'm not a man who takes a screwdriver to cameras like a lot of people I know.
Oh, really? Nice.
I have collector friends who can't wait to buy a new camera and then take it apart. No, that's not me. I mean, taking it apart is easy.
Yeah.
It's the getting it together again after.
I have, cool. Nice. Feels nice. It feels like a real, again, a quality kit, doesn't it?
It feels quality, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yes, in answer to your previous question, yes, they are rare. You do see them, but not too often.
Right.
And we're going to do one more before the Second World War breaks out. And that's this. Now, this is the Kine Exacta. And it's the first 35mm single lens reflex. It was thought at one time that it wasn't. There's a Russian camera called the Sport, which is a very ugly looking camera. And for a while, people said that was the first. When Russia opened up a bit more and records came out, it was proved that this beat it by about a fortnight or something like that.
Really?
You know? So this is, and it's a much, much nicer camera. Again, for the purist watching, this isn't the first version because it's got a square viewfinder there. The first version has got a round viewfinder.
Right.
Which is another typical collector's C. They're the ones that are expensive.
The round one.
These are quite reasonable. But irrespective of it being the second version, the shape, etc., the model is the first 35mm single lens reflex. And it had quite a few innovations about it anyway. Yeah, she still works. One of the things is it would take shutter speeds right down to a full 12 seconds. And it did that by setting the shutter to the B setting, which opens and then closes, and then winding it up here, which I'm not going to do because it's a bit delicate, winding it to the speed you want, and then it would take the speed, open the shutter, use the clockwork motor in there
to close it. Okay.
To close it when it was necessary. It also got a little thing on the bottom here, that if I unscrew that like that and put it out like that, what it's doing, there's a little knife in there, which as I do that, I could slice through the film, which means I could take the film out halfway and develop it.
Oh, right, it's got a knife to cut the film in the camera.
That was quite a thing with Exacta. They did that with quite a few of their models. But typical, it's a very nice Exacta. Exactas are, to be honest, as a collector, I'm a bit afraid of Exactas because there's so many of them.
Right.
And if you've got the collector's instinct, once you get...
Okay.
So this is a sum total of Exactas in my collection.
Is this German again?
Yep, Ihagi made it.
The Germans really dominated cameras
in
that period between the wars.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they did right up until, the Japanese arrived with a vengeance in about 1959.
Yeah. And this was 1930?
That's 36.
36.
36, yeah, 36.
Same year as the Berlin Olympics.
Yes.
They think they'd have done some marketing. If they had done the same as Zenith did, or some Olympic rings.
Yes, yeah. Yes, well, I can't remember the name. What's Hitler's special photographer?
Oh, Leni Riefenstahl.
Yeah, that's her. Whether she used one or not, I can't tell you. So that's 1936, and so, of course, by this time, things are getting a little bit dodgy in Europe, and by 1939, World War II broke out, and again, things stagnated for a while. Yeah. So we'll continue in another video with what happened after the war.
That's fascinating, and some of these cameras, you say, are iconic, and they've been so influential in photography to this day.
Yeah.
So I hope you enjoyed that, found it interesting. Do comment below what you think of this video, and also which of these cameras is your favourite. Which one would you most like to have? and do look forward to the next video when we'll be looking at cameras post-war. Until then, hope you like, subscribe, and see you in the next video.